Well, hello. I've already promised you in a previous video that this lecture on, or this video on Sappho will be on the shorter side, so I am really going to try to make good on that promise. I will say right now that if you haven't already printed out the Sappho PDF and have that in front of you, I would take the time to do that. I am going to be reading just a little bit from her poems. You're going to need to print that out anyway. So I would go ahead and do that at this time. All right. Well, what's the significance of Sappho? Why are we reading? Why are we reading this? Well, we have already read poetry in this course. We've read the Odyssey, which is a good example of epic poetry. But we haven't read any lyric poetry, and that's what Sappho wrote. Indeed, Sappho, I think, is generally considered the first great lyric poet in the Western tradition. And Sappho, just in case you weren't already in the know, Sappho is a woman. So let's be clear about that from the get-go. So what is lyric poetry? When I say that she wrote lyric poetry, what exactly does that mean? Lyric poetry is poetry that explores the thoughts and meditations of the speaker. Okay. Lyric poetry explores the thoughts and meditations of the speaker. Honestly, I think when most people today talk about poetry, this is what they're thinking of. Okay. They're not usually thinking of epic poetry, tragic poetry, or something like that, but they're thinking of lyric poetry. Now, I want to emphasize one word that I just used there in that definition, the thoughts and meditations of the speaker. And as always with poetry, we can never assume that the poet, him and herself, and the speaker in the poem are one and the same. Okay? They might be completely different. So the poet may be taking on a persona that is dramatically different than the actual persona of the poet, him or herself. Or it could be a persona that is not radically different from that of the poet, but perhaps different in some subtle ways. Another way of saying this is that the poetic I, letter I, capital I, the poetic I is not the same as the personal I. And this can get really tricky with Sappho because Sappho will even use her own name at times in her poetry. And so it's all too tempting to imagine, oh, well, this is a poem that she is really writing about herself, or this poem directly reflects an experience that Sappho had at some point in her life. Maybe, but maybe not. And we can't jump to conclusions there. And of course, it doesn't even really matter in the end just how fictional the speaker is. We just need to be aware that the speaker and the poet, these are two different entities. All right, a little bit about Sappho. We're going to actually take a step backwards chronologically. So we're going to go back to the days of archaic Greece, not quite all the way back to the time of Homer, but to the late 600s, the late 7th century. We think that Sappho really sort of flourished around 610 or something like that. And she was Greek, but again, this is another example of a Greek who did not live in what we now think of as Greece. She lived on the island of Lesbos, Lesbos, which was a Greek island, Greek in terms of language and culture. Not that far, however, from Sardis, which was a city on the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. A quite wealthy and cosmopolitan city at that. So even though she was on an island, she was not sort of cut off from the rest of the world and, lived in a fairly cosmopolitan environment. She's most famous for her poetry, and I'll spend most of my time talking about that. However, I will also want to mention the fact that she was a renowned musician and musical innovator. So she's said to have invented a new sort of plucking device for the lyre. She's also said to have invented a new type of lyre, stringed musical instrument, as well as sort of developing a new mode, a new scale for music. And I wanted to mention this because I think it's very important to understand, in our culture, music and poetry are in many cases sort of in separate spheres. But in ancient Greece, poetry would have pretty much always been performed with musical accompaniment. Okay? And let's take the name lyric poetry. Okay? Lyric poetry, that name comes from the lyre, from the musical instrument, because when people would perform this kind of poetry, they wouldn't just sort of read it, from a piece of paper. It would be sung, usually with some kind of musical instrument playing with it. So in a very real sense, what we're reading for this week, when we read Sappho, we're reading lyrics. Right? Notice we use that word. Lyrics are songs that are set to musical accompaniment. But she was famous both in her day and later, not primarily for her musical achievements, but for the poetry itself. Okay, she is said to have written 9 entire books of poetry, something like 10,000 lines. So she was highly prolific. Sadly, however, we have only about 1% of her output. So all we have left of these 10,000 or so lines are about 250 fragments. You're going to be reading poem 1. That is the only complete poem we have by Sappho. Everything else is in fragmentary condition. Now you might ask, how was this possible? Particularly since, as I'll say in a moment, she was very popular in her own time. Well, the ravages of time certainly have a big role to play. I mean, there's lots of other great authors from the ancient Greek world whose works have been lost, so she's not unique in that sense. But there's more to the story than that. Later on in the Common Era, Christian leaders, Christian bishops and clergy, were not big fans of Sappho. And I think as you read, you'll be able to figure out why that is, why Sappho's poetry would not mesh really well with a Christian ethos. So, the only way literary works were kept alive in the ancient world before the 15th century was through being copied. And it would seem that once Christianity really had won the day, Sappho's works were just not copied all that much. So we have these sort of papyrus fragments today, and we have to work with those. But as I just said, she was a real celebrity poet in her own day. Some of the greatest figures of ancient Greece spoke of Sappho in the highest terms imaginable. So Solon, you read in West in the World, I think last week, about Solon, a great Athenian politician who helped sort of pave the way for democracy. Solon once said of her poetry, "Let me learn it and then let me die." Right? Because after Sappho's poetry, everything else in life could only be a disappointment. Or take somebody like Plato. Plato, who's not always well disposed towards poets. He referred to her as the 10th muse. According to Greek mythology, there are 9 muses, and they inspire artists and poets and musicians and so on. So he considered her sort of, among that group. And in general, she was known by a number of people in ancient Greece simply as the poetess. So Homer was the poet, So if somebody said, as the poet said, everybody would know, okay, well, that's Homer. Well, in the same way, people would say the poetess, and everybody would know, okay, we're talking about Sappho. So a celebrated figure in ancient world, but still very much a mysterious figure to us. There's a lot about her biography that we don't really know. We're not even sure that she was literate in the sense of being able to write. She may have sort of dictated her poetry. We're just not sure. We're not entirely sure whether she had a daughter. Some evidence suggests she did, but nothing definitive. And even her sexuality is a matter of controversy. Now, you should know that the term lesbian, as we use it today, does go back to Sappho, okay? Because as you'll see, number of her poems are celebrations of women's erotic love for other women. So that's where we get that term. So it might be easy to simply assume that Sappho herself was a lesbian in the modern sense. But that's not totally clear either. And again, later in the ancient world, she seemed to have a reputation as being a bit of a cougar, but a heterosexual cougar. So we're not quite sure. And again, this is one of the reasons why I cautioned you about simply assuming that the speaker in these poems, even if the speaker is named Sappho, is the same as the actual historical Sappho, the poet. So again, we have to be careful about that. I think in the end, it doesn't really matter that much, right, in terms of interpreting the poetry, whether or not Sappho, the poet herself, what she liked to do when the lights were off. I think we can read her poetry just fine without ever really knowing that. I should also mention, before I sort of get a little bit deeper into the poetry, that we still are learning more about her poetry all the time. 2 almost complete poems were discovered in 2014. There may be more in the pipeline. So I think as time goes on, we're going to have a better understanding and appreciation of Sappho. All right, so let me just offer you some guiding remarks before you jump into the poems yourself and read them. I would certainly encourage you and indeed mandate that you read the translator's introduction. That is actually part of your reading assignment. So read that. It gets a little fancy, especially towards the end, but I think it's a pretty good introduction to her poetry. There's not a lot that you'll be reading in terms of words. And in fact, if you have already printed out the PDF, it's even less reading than you think, because the version we're giving you has got the Greek on one side of the page and the English on the other, and obviously you can disregard the Greek. So it's not a lot of verbiage for you to read. So take your time. I mean, you should do that with poetry anyway, but you can really afford to take your time with Sappho. Be sure to have your study guide out so you can refer to that as you read, so you kind of know what to be reading for. Now, there are certain challenges that are endemic in reading Sappho. One I've already hinted at, and that is the fragmentary nature of the poetry itself. There will be a frustrating number of brackets in your reading. And what those brackets represent are places where either part of the papyrus is missing or it's illegible, so we're just not sure. There was something in there, but we're just not quite sure what it was. So you're going to have to deal with that. And then in some of the poems, this is, I know, especially true of poem 1, you're going to have a challenge that you often face reading any kind of poetry, even if it's something like Song of Songs from the Bible, the challenge of identifying the speaker. There may be more than one speaker in a poem, and it's not always sort of clearly indicated to you when one speaker begins to speak and when that speaker stops and the other speaker sort of takes it from there. So just be attentive to those kinds of matters. Well, in terms of themes to be reading for, the main theme, as you might guess, is love. Sappho is arguably the first great lyric poet of the Western tradition, and she is also arguably the first great love poet of the Western tradition. Most of her poetry has something to do with love. Poem 1 is especially pertinent. I think if you want to know Sappho's take on love, that's a really good place to go. Of course, it doesn't hurt that it's actually a complete poem, that there are no brackets involved. So as you read this poem and others, ask yourself, what is Sappho saying about love? What does she think that love does to us? What is love like? And what kind of effect or effects does love have on us? Let me just read the opening couple of stanzas of poem 1. So you might want to have that out in front of you. It's the poem that begins with Deathless Aphrodite. Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind. Spangled means glittering. Child of Zeus, who twists lures, I beg you, do not break with hard pains, O lady, my heart. But come here, if ever before you caught my voice far off, and listening, left your father's golden house and came, yoking your car. So it's a direct address to Aphrodite, who of course is the goddess of love in the Greek tradition. And ask yourself, what is the significance of the fact that Sappho is attributing love to a goddess, that she is addressing Aphrodite? What is she trying to say about the nature of love? And I think I'll just give you one hint here. On the one hand, she seems to be saying that love is divine, right? Love comes to us from the divine realm. But you have to remember how the Greeks saw their gods. They saw their gods maybe not quite in the same way that we see God or Jesus. For the Greeks, the gods are powerful. They're also dangerous and a little bit unpredictable. And so the gods aren't safe, in other words. So to say that love is divine is, elevates love in some ways, but also reflects the dangers involved in love. Notice, too, in that second line there, Aphrodite who twists lures. I mean, Aphrodite who makes traps is basically what is being said here. And again, that suggests there's a kind of slightly darker side to love. So that's poem 1. You want to pay especially close attention to that. Also, I think fragment 16 is one that is one of the more important in your reading assignment. This is the one that starts with "Some men say." As you read this, this poem has a lot to say about Helen of Troy, and you, of course, know some things about her. You're going to see a little bit later in the course one view of Helen in the Aeneid. You've already seen another view of Helen in the Odyssey, right? Helen makes a bit of a cameo when Telemachus is there visiting Menelaus, and Helen is sort of embarrassed about the fact that she ran off with Paris. She regrets it. She repents of it. She says, I was, overcome by this momentary desire. I should have known better. That's Homer's take. Sappho's take on Helen is really quite different. She praises Helen for her action, for leaving husband, children behind, and following her heart. So this is a kind of revisionist take on the story of Helen and Paris. She followed her heart's desire, consequences be damned, and you know what? Good for her. You go, girl. That's Sappho's take on it. Notice there's a connection here between this fragment and poem 1. Aphrodite, right? It's Aphrodite who hooks Paris up with Helen in the first place. So again, we have that sort of divine origin of love. And then let me just read the first couple of lines of this poem, because I think what you're getting is not just a revisionist take on Homer's depiction of Helen, but you're getting a kind of more broad anti-Homeric attitude. Okay. First couple of lines of fragment 16. Some men say an army of horse, and some men say an army on foot, and some men say an army of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is what you love. What you love is the most beautiful thing. And if you go on to the next page, this would be page 29. Hopefully I didn't. Yes, okay, that's right, page 29. She's talking about some woman named Anactoria. We don't know really about who that is. But anyway, she says on page 29, or the speaker says, I would rather see her lovely step and the motion of light on her face than chariots of Lydians or ranks of foot soldiers in arms. So for male poets like Homer, there's just nothing more beautiful than warriors and arms, great armies clashing over the plains. This is what really gets people like Homer off. But for Sappho, for the speaker of this poem anyway, the most beautiful thing in the world is the beloved, whoever it is that you happen to love. So this is maybe the first sort of make love and not war kind of statement in Western literature, and one that I think is maybe pushing back a little bit against the Homeric tradition. Is there any good higher than loving and being loved? For Sappho, the answer is no. All right, well, a little longer than I intended, but definitely shorter than the other videos, so I will stop right now.